Now, between Occupy Wall Street in New York and the other cities it spread to, as well as the October 2011 movement that just began right here in D.C., something seems to be happening in this country. But what could it actually lead to? Well, earlier I spoke with Chris Hedges, Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter and author of The World as It Is, Dispatches on the Myth of Human Progress. Now, he was also in Freedom Plaza in D.C. today. And Hedges is somebody that said that civil disobedience is our only hope for the future of this country. So I asked him if civil disobedience is what he thinks we're seeing right now.
Yeah. I think people have finally woken up to the kleptocracy that we live in. And the fact that the only word that these corporations know is more. There are no impediments now to a rapacious reconfiguring of the United States and the global economy into a form of neo-feudalism. They recognize that the political system is broken, that the commercial press, the judiciary, the elected officials are essentially wholly owned subsidiaries of the corporate state. And we're seeing a reaction. And it's, of course, for those of us who have been calling for acts of civil disobedience and physical defiance of the corporate state, it's deeply heartening.
What about those that are a part of the corporate media? You could say, especially we're seeing a lot of this on Fox News, or elected officials, people that want to be elected officials like Herman Cain. They're saying that this is anti-American, because if you're anti-corporation, you're anti-free markets, and you're anti-America, and you're anti-freedom overall.
Well, of course. I mean, and who owns those networks? General Electric, Viacom, Rupert Murdoch's News Corp, Disney. There's about a half dozen corporations that control almost everything most Americans see, watch, read, or hear. And they are going to make damn sure that the people who get on the airwaves that they control disseminate the message they want. And that's precisely the message. But I think an increasing number of Americans across the political spectrum are seeing through that mendacity. And I think the corporate state's in trouble.
But do you think that that's playing into perhaps the division that we see right now with the Tea Party movement, which you could say it was co-opted somewhere along the way, but originally it came out of this frustration that a lot of Americans had towards the bailouts, right? Then later on, President Obama's health care plan. And is that message working to divide the groups? Should the Tea Party have the same thing in common as Occupy Wall Street and the October 2011?
The Tea Party, I think when you look closely at its origins, was from the beginning a creation of the corporatists like the Koch brothers and others. And it functions as America's fascist party. It celebrates the gun culture, the language of violence, the undercurrents of racism, the scapegoating of people who are vulnerable and weak within the society, Muslims, undocumented workers, homosexuals, intellectuals. It has all the hallmarks of a classically fascist organization, including the fact that it's bankrolled by the most retrograde elements within American society. And the people who bankroll it have turned anger, and of course you're right that they are tapping into a legitimate rage, but they have deflected that rage away from where it should be directed, which is Wall Street, towards government, because corporations want government to become weaker, more anemic, to destroy what tepid controls and regulations are left, and there isn't, of course, much left.
So you don't blame government? Do you think that perhaps individual politicians, people like President Barack Obama, are they just slaves to the system, essentially, because they depend on campaign donations, they depend on the money, and there's no way to get out of it?
I wouldn't call them slaves to the system. I mean, Barack Obama is certainly intelligent enough to understand where power lies and what he has to do in order to stay in office, whose interests he has to serve. And he has served those interests as assiduously as did George W. Bush. The fact is, there is no way within the American political system to vote against the interests of Goldman Sachs. It doesn't matter whether it's Bush or Obama or McCain or anyone else. We live in a society that in which the citizenry has been utterly disempowered, rendered impotent. And it doesn't matter what citizens want. Even when we vote, for instance, in 2006 against the war in Iraq, turn the control of the Congress back over to the Democrats, what does the Democratic Party do? It continues to not only fund the war, but increase troop levels in Iraq by 30,000. Obamacare ends up being 2,000 pages written by corporate lobbyists the equivalent of the bank bailout bill to the pharmaceutical and insurance industry, $400 billion in subsidies. Obama has expanded the reach of imperial wars, including proxy wars in Somalia, Yemen, Pakistan. He has not restored habeas corpus. On all of the major structural issues, there is no difference. There's a complete continuity. And, of course, the working class and the poor and increasingly the middle class have to pay the price. And it doesn't matter whether it's Democrat or Republican, and that's the fuel of these movements.
So how do you see this playing out? Do you think, I mean, for example, let's look back at the Occupy Wall Street movement that's going on in New York right now. Yesterday, they saw some of the largest numbers that they've had thus far, and they were met with a police presence, right? People were arrested. There were batons that were thrown. There was pepper spray. Does it have to be violent, or can it be done peacefully?
Well, the more frightened the power elite becomes, the more violent and draconian will be the measures of control. And the security and surveillance state in this country is profound, deep, immense, and brutal, and growing. And where's the movement going? I've covered movements all around the world. I covered all of the revolutions in Eastern Europe, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Romania, all the uprisings against Milosevic in Belgrade. When movements like these begin, you never know where they're going. Even the leaders don't know where they're going. I was sitting in a room in Leipzig on the afternoon of November 9th, 1989, with the leaders of the East German opposition, and they were saying that perhaps within a year there would be free passage back and forth across the Berlin Wall. Within a few hours, the wall didn't exist. So, I mean, that's a small illustration of the fact that even the purported leaders of populist movements like this one have no idea where it's going to go. We're all hoping that it becomes so powerful and so immense that it begins to shift power away from the 1% back to the rest of the citizenry.
Would you compare this moment to what we saw going on in the 1960s here in America?
I think the 60s were different. The new left in the 60s was largely a middle-class phenomena. It was severed from labor. Labor did not support the new left, including the fact that the AFL-CIO supported Nixon's war in Indochina and denounced the kids in the street as hippies. And I think what we're seeing now is something different. I think that the commonality of interests against the corporate state is a kind of unifying factor that can bring together everyone from libertarians to people like myself who worked in 2008 for Ralph Nader.
Well, we're still seeing, of course, the hippie word being thrown around right now with the protesters, although if you look around, you can see it's not just young people, it's an older generation as well. It's taking part.
Primarily younger.
But would you say, is there a fear here? Let's say if the economy does finally rebound, gets back on track, might we see the same thing as post-60s? These people move into the suburbs, they get jobs, and they're now the ones working in the financial sector.
Because the fact is there are no jobs. I mean, real wages for American workers since the early 70s have remained stagnant or declined. We maintain both a level of consumption and an empire through credit. That credit is dried up. The manufacturing base has been decimated. Wall Street speculators, and remember in the 17th century, speculation was a crime. Speculators were hung. They control our financial system. And so the idea that we're going to rebound, I mean, we're watching the European banking system, as I speak, stand on the edge of collapse. It's not just Greece that's going to default, but most likely Italy, Portugal, Spain, and the repercussions of that are going to reach our shores. So, you know, there were no restrictions placed on Wall Street. They looted the U.S. Treasury in 2008. They went right back to their old games, and we're headed most likely for another crash. And unless we stand up and stop them, they'll come back and help themselves to whatever money we have left.
Now, of course, this October 2011 movement is about corporatism. It's also about militarism. And now it's been 10 full years with the war in Afghanistan. Do you think it's ever going to end?
Yeah, because we're losing the war. The Taliban controls about 70–75% of Afghanistan. We have replicated the disastrous occupation of the Red Army, where we control the urban centers, sort of. I mean, we see attacks even in Kabul. But only 20% of the Afghans live in urban centers. The rest of the country is either controlled by the Taliban or in dispute. And it's an unsustainable war, both financially and militarily. both in Iraq and Afghanistan. We bought a kind of temporary graveyard peace after 1.2 million Iraqis were killed. I've spent a lot of time in Iraq, and I can assure you that that also, over the long term, is not sustainable. So these are wars we can't win. We've wasted, what, $4 trillion, absurd sums of money that could have been used to put every American in this country to work, gave us the best public education in the world as well as access to the finest health care in the world, and we just poured it down a rat hole.
Chris, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.